My mailman has been delivering to my street for 11 years. His name is Roy, and every Tuesday and Thursday he stops at my mailbox at almost exactly the same time, 10:45 in the morning, and if I happen to be pulling weeds in the front garden, he'll tip his cap and say something about the weather. He is not the kind of man who involves himself in other people's business. That is why, when he knocked on my front door one Thursday in October, instead of simply leaving the mail in the box, I knew immediately that whatever he had to say was not something he had decided lightly. I opened the door, still holding my pruning shears. He looked uncomfortable. He held my small stack of envelopes against his chest, rather than handing them to me, as if he needed something to do with his hands. "Eleanor," he said, "I want you to know—" I almost didn't say anything. I told myself it wasn't my place. He paused. "But I kept thinking about it all week. And I think you should know." I waited. "Your son," he said. "He's been coming here on Sundays. Every Sunday, from what I can tell. And he doesn't come alone. His wife is with him most times." He finally held out the mail. "I do my overtime route on Sundays, and I've seen his car in your driveway 5 weeks in a row now. And Eleanor." He stopped again. "You don't seem to be home when he comes." I stared at him. I volunteered at the hospital every Sunday morning. George and I had started going together, reading to patients in the long-term care ward, back when he was still well enough. After George passed, I kept going alone. It was the one thing that made Sunday mornings feel like something other than the quietest, heaviest hours of the week. My son knew this. I thanked Roy, and I stood there in the doorway long after he'd continued down the street, long after his orange truck had disappeared around the corner. The pruning shears were still in my hand. My palm had gone cold. My son's name is Daniel. He is 43 years old. He works in commercial real estate, and he drives a gray SUV. And he calls me every other Sunday evening. The Sundays he is apparently not inside my house to ask how I am doing, and whether I need anything. His wife, Brenda, is polite in the way that a person can be polite, without ever being warm. She remembers to send a birthday card. She does not remember what is in the card by the time she sends the next one. George had been gone for 14 months. In the last 2 years of his life, George and I had spent a great deal of time going through the house together. Not because we were morbid people, but because George was practical. He'd been an estate attorney for 30 years, and he had seen in tremendous and painful detail what happened to families when nothing was documented. So, we made lists. We photographed everything of value. We wrote descriptions beside each item in a leather notebook that I kept in the drawer of my nightstand, the antique writing desk in the study, the set of silver candlesticks from my mother, the oil painting above the fireplace that George had bought at an auction in 1987, the cabinet of first edition books in the hallway, the jewelry box on my dresser. We noted what we wanted to go where, and to whom, and why. After George died, Daniel had offered several times to help me sort through things. I had told him each time that there was nothing to sort through, that everything was already documented, and that I was not ready. He had nodded and changed the subject. I had not thought much of it. I thought about it now. I went back inside, and I sat at the kitchen table for a long time. I am not a woman who panics. I am 67 years old, and I have buried a husband and outlasted a cancer diagnosis, and raised a child mostly alone during 3 years when George was working in another city. I do not fall apart easily. But I will tell you honestly that sitting at that kitchen table, I felt something I had not felt since the morning I found George on the bathroom floor. A cold, spreading sense that the world I thought I understood had shifted underneath me without my permission. I made a list of what I needed to do, in order. First, I needed to know if anything was missing. I got the leather notebook from my nightstand. I spent the better part of that Thursday afternoon walking through every room, comparing what was there against what was written. Most things were where they should be, but when I got to the hallway cabinet, I stopped. There were 3 books missing. A first edition of To Kill a Mockingbird that George had found at an estate sale in Charleston, a signed copy of Hemingway's A Farewell to Arms, and a small, thin 1,922 printing of T.S. Eliot's The Waste Land with a handwritten inscription on the inside cover from a poet whose name I didn't recognize, but whose signature George had been extraordinarily proud of. I stood in front of the cabinet for a long time. Then I went upstairs to the bedroom. The jewelry box on my dresser looked exactly the same. But when I opened it, the strand of pearls my mother had given me on my wedding day was gone. So was the diamond brooch George had bought me for our 30th anniversary. The small ruby ring Georgian era, purchased at an antique fair in Bath during the trip we took for our 25th, was not in the velvet slot where it had lived for 20 years. I sat down on the edge of the bed. I am not a stupid woman. I want to be clear about that. But I am a woman who had been grieving for 14 months. A woman who sometimes walked into a room and forgot why she'd come. A woman whose sleep had been unreliable since the night she'd reached across a bed that was half empty and understood, in her body rather than her mind, that it would always be half empty now. And I will admit to you that my first thought was not that Daniel had taken these things. My first thought was that I had moved them myself during one of those gray, half-conscious hours and simply didn't remember. I sat on the bed for a long time, going back and forth. Then I remembered the notebook. I had written the location of every item. The ruby ring, small velvet slot, top left jewelry box on Eleanor's dresser. The pearls, white satin pouch, second drawer, jewelry box, the Hemingway, hallway cabinet, third shelf, left side. Everything with a place, everything documented. I had not moved them. I would have noted it. I went back to the kitchen, and I sat down again. And this time I let myself think clearly about what Roy had told me. Daniel. Every Sunday, when I was not home. The question I had to answer was not whether he had taken them. I already knew the answer to that. The question was what I was going to do about it. I did not call Daniel that evening. I did not call the police either. Not yet. Not without something I could show them. I sat in the kitchen after dinner and I thought about what I needed, and what I needed was proof, not because I doubted myself, but because I understood. With the cold clarity that came from being married to an estate attorney for 40 years, that doubt is a weapon, and that the first thing Daniel would do if I confronted him was make me doubt myself. He would say he was worried about me. He would say I'd always been forgetful. He would bring up the grief, the 14 months of it, and he would turn my loss into evidence of my incompetence. He would say he was just keeping things safe for me. I needed him not to be able to do that. I drove to an electronics store the next morning. I am not particularly tech-savvy, but I am not helpless either, and the young man behind the counter was patient and kind. He showed me 3 different small cameras, explained how they worked, and recommended one that was about the size of a deck of cards, battery-powered, motion-activated, and could be connected to my phone so I could see the footage from anywhere. It recorded to a small memory card, and also backed up to a cloud account. $89. I bought 2. When I got home, I spent an hour thinking about placement. The hallway cabinet was the obvious choice. That was where the remaining books were. But I wanted coverage of more than one area. I placed the first camera inside the antique mantel clock in the study, the one with the glass face that George had bought at auction. I removed the inner workings years ago when the ticking kept me up at night, so the body of the clock was hollow. I positioned the lens just inside the glass, angled toward the bookshelf and the door. You would have to know exactly what you were looking at to notice it. The second camera I placed on the windowsill in the bedroom, tucked behind a small wooden box that had been there so long it had become invisible, the way things do when they've never been moved. I angled it toward the dresser and the jewelry box. I charged both cameras overnight. Saturday morning I tested them, walking through each room and checking the footage on my phone. The picture was clear. You could read the spines of the books in the hallway from the study camera's angle. You could see the individual compartments of the jewelry box from the bedroom camera. I went to the hospital on Sunday morning, as I always did. I sat beside a woman named June, who was 91 years old and had been in the long-term ward for 3 months, and whose family visited twice. I read her 2 chapters of a novel she had chosen, and she held my hand during the sad parts. And when I left, she told me I had a kind voice. I drove home. I made myself wait until I had taken off my coat and put the kettle on before I looked at my phone. There was footage. My hands were steady. I want you to know that. My hands were completely steady when I pressed play. Daniel and Brenda arrived at 11:14 in the morning. They let themselves in with a key. His key. The spare I had given him when George first got sick. In case of emergencies. He walked directly to the study. He moved with the ease of someone who had done this before, who knew the layout, who was not nervous. He went straight to the hallway cabinet and ran his finger along the remaining books, pulling one out, checking something on his phone, a photograph, I realized. He was comparing what was left against a photograph he had taken on a previous visit, a shopping list. He took 2 more books and put them in a canvas tote bag he had brought with him. Brenda went upstairs. I watched the bedroom camera footage. She opened the jewelry box immediately, without looking around first, without any hesitation. She knew exactly where to go. She took the remaining items slowly, one by one, holding each one up to the light from the window. She was wearing latex gloves. That detail, the gloves landed somewhere in my chest like a stone dropped into still water. This was not impulsive. This was not a confused son taking something he thought his mother no longer needed, telling himself it was practically his anyway. This was planned. The gloves meant they had thought about fingerprints. The canvas bag meant they had thought about carrying capacity. The photograph on his phone meant they had been cataloging what remained, return trip by return trip, working through my home the way you'd work through an estate after someone had already died. They left at 11:47. 33 minutes. I sat in the kitchen with my tea until it went cold. I did not call Daniel. Not yet. I called my attorney instead. Her name is Patricia, and George had recommended her years ago, and she has handled my affairs ever since. I told her what Roy had told me, what I had found missing, and what the cameras had recorded. I described the footage in detail. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, in a very calm and careful voice, that I needed to bring her the footage, keep the cameras running, and not say a word to Daniel or Brenda until we had spoken again. "Do you have documentation of what was taken?" she asked. I told her about the notebook. There was a pause. "George taught you well," she said. I asked her what I was dealing with, legally. "Theft," she said. "Potentially grand larceny, depending on the value of what's been taken, and given that they used a key you gave him in good faith, and that they appear to have been doing this systematically over multiple weeks. Eleanor, this is not a gray area." I met with Patricia on Tuesday. I brought the footage on a USB drive, the leather notebook, and the photographs George and I had taken of every item. Patricia watched the footage twice. She made notes. She told me that what the camera had captured was clear, unambiguous, and that combined with the inventory documentation, we had an extremely strong case. "What do you want to do?" she asked. I told her I wanted to do it properly. I wanted him to be there when it happened. I did not want to simply file a report and wait for a phone call. I wanted to look him in the eye. Patricia considered this. "We can arrange that," she said. We planned it for the following Sunday evening. I would call Daniel on Saturday, as I sometimes did, and invite him and Brenda to dinner on Sunday. Casually. Nothing alarming. Patricia would contact the detective assigned to the case. She had already been in touch with the police, who had reviewed the footage and confirmed they had enough to proceed, and 2 officers would arrive at my home at 7 o'clock. By the time they knocked on my door, Daniel and Brenda would already be inside, already seated at my table. I cooked pot roast, George's recipe, the one I have been making for 40 years, the one Daniel grew up eating on Sunday evenings in this house, at this table, in this kitchen that still smelled like the same dish soap we had always bought and the same wood polish on the floors. I set the table with the good placemats and the cloth napkins. I lit the candles, not the silver candlesticks. Those were on the list as missing, and Patricia needed them documented as gone, but the plain white ones from the pantry. Daniel and Brenda arrived at 6:30. He kissed me on the cheek. She said the house smelled wonderful. We sat down and I served the food, and for 20 minutes we talked about nothing. His work, her sister's new house, the weather turning cold. Daniel had 2 glasses of wine. Brenda talked about a kitchen renovation they were planning. I listened and I nodded and I asked questions and I looked at my son across the table and tried to find the boy I had raised in his face. At 7 o'clock exactly, there was a knock at the door. Daniel looked up. I folded my napkin and set it beside my plate and stood up. "I'll get it," I said. The 2 officers were in plain clothes, as Patricia and I had discussed. They identified themselves quietly at the door, and I stepped aside to let them in, and I walked back to the dining room ahead of them. Daniel had his wine glass halfway to his mouth when he saw them. "Daniel," I said, "these officers would like to speak with you." I watched his face change. It happened in stages. The way weather changes the confidence first, dropping away like a curtain, then something that tried to be confusion and didn't quite make it. Then, underneath all of it, the thing I had been most afraid to see, and most necessary to see, the recognition. He knew immediately what this was about. He did not have the expression of a man who had no idea why 2 police officers were standing in his mother's dining room on a Sunday evening. He had the expression of a man who had been waiting, somewhere in the back of his mind, for this moment to arrive. Brenda started to say something. One of the officers asked her gently to wait. I sat back down at the table. I ate my pot roast while Patricia's careful preparation. 4 weeks of security footage, 40 years of meticulous documentation, and the memory of a practical man who had loved me very much, did the rest of the work. They were both arrested that evening. The charges included grand larceny and breaking and entering, the latter because the key had been given in trust, and its use to enter a home without the owner's knowledge or permission constituted illegal entry under state law, Patricia had explained. The items already removed from my home were recovered from a storage unit. Daniel had been renting the unit, was in Brenda's name, along with several other objects I had not yet noticed were missing, including a small bronze sculpture that had sat on the mantelpiece in the study for so long, I had stopped seeing it. The full inventory of what they had taken was valued, in the end, at just over $42,000. I want to be honest with you about what the weeks after that were like, because I think honesty is the only thing worth offering when you tell a story like this one. They were not triumphant weeks. There was no feeling of victory, not in the clean, satisfying way you might imagine. There was something more complicated, a kind of grief that was different from the grief I had been carrying for 14 months, but just as heavy, the grief of understanding that the version of your son you thought existed is not the version that does exist, and that no amount of pot roast on Sunday evenings or bedtime stories or school plays attended or tuition paid can guarantee you the child you were trying to raise. Daniel's attorney contacted Patricia to discuss a plea arrangement. I left those conversations entirely to Patricia. I did not want to negotiate. I wanted what the law offered, and Patricia knew how to ask for it. In the end, both Daniel and Brenda pleaded guilty to grand larceny. The judge, in sentencing, noted the particularly troubling nature of the crime: a son exploiting his access to a recently widowed mother's home, taking advantage of her grief and her trust, targeting a woman who was actively vulnerable. He used the phrase elder financial abuse, and he said it without softening it. I appreciated that. I had spent several weeks wondering if people would soften it, would find some way to frame it as a misunderstanding, a family matter, something that didn't deserve its proper name. The judge did not do that. Daniel was sentenced to 18 months, suspended to 2 years of probation and mandatory community service, on the condition that full restitution be made. The items recovered from the storage unit were returned to me. The items that had already been sold, 3 of the books, it turned out, and had already gone to a private collector, were covered by a restitution agreement, structured through the sale of the storage unit's contents, and a lien on Daniel and Brenda's joint property. Patricia made sure the restitution was real, not $500 a month from someone without income. Real and enforceable, and tied to actual assets. George would have done it the same way. I kept the cameras up for another 3 months, until I felt ready to take them down. I don't know exactly when that feeling arrived. It came quietly, the way most important things do. One morning I woke up, and the house felt like mine again. Fully mine, the way a house feels when you're not listening for something wrong in every room. Roy still delivers my mail at 10:45 on Tuesdays and Thursdays. I started leaving a small bundle of tomatoes from my garden on the porch for him in the summers. He never mentions the October he knocked on my door, and neither do I. But there is something in the way he tips his cap that is different now. A small, mutual acknowledgement. We know what we did. I have a granddaughter from Daniel's first marriage, his daughter from a relationship before he met Brenda, a girl named Casey, who is 14 years old, and who came to me about 6 months after the sentencing, alone, riding the bus to my neighborhood for the first time on her own. She knocked on the front door, and when I opened it, she looked up at me with eyes that were very much her father's, and said, "I heard what happened. I'm sorry, I know that's not enough, but I didn't know what else to say." I told her it was exactly enough. I told her to come in. She comes for dinner most Saturdays now. She has started reading the books in the hallway cabinet, the ones that are left, and the ones that have been returned. Last week she asked me about the inscription in the T.S. Eliot. I told her everything George had told me about it, which wasn't much, but she listened the way people listen when they understand that stories are worth keeping. I am not naive enough to think that what happened to me is unusual. I have spoken since then with other women at the hospital, at the library, at the senior center where I started volunteering on Thursday afternoons, who have their own versions of this story. A nephew who offered to help manage a bank account. A daughter who borrowed a car and didn't return it. A son who moved in after a health scare and stayed after the scare passed, and the lease on his apartment ran out. The particulars differ. The structure is always the same. A person who is loved, and a person who decides that love is a door they can walk through without asking. I want to say something clearly to anyone who might be listening and who recognizes any part of what I've described. You are not losing your mind. If things are disappearing from your home, they are disappearing because someone is taking them. If you are being told that your memory is unreliable, consider who benefits from you believing that. Document what you have. Photograph it. Write it down with dates and locations. Trust the neighbor who knocks on your door with something odd, and if you need to set a place at the table and light the candles and cook the meal and wait calmly until 7 o'clock, then do that. There is nothing small about a woman who knows exactly what she's doing. George would have been proud of the notebook. He would have been heartbroken about Daniel, and then, after the heartbreak, he would have been proud of the notebook. I keep it in the nightstand still. I've added pages. Not because I expect another loss, I don't, but because documentation is a form of respect for the things that matter, and for the life you have built around them. And I have built a life worth documenting. Casey thinks so too. She told me last Saturday, while we were eating dinner, that when she grows up she wants a house full of books with stories attached to them. I told her I would leave her all of mine.